A child's heartbreak over a loaf of bread shattered my quiet bakery, but the real shock arrived hours later, roaring up to my doorstep on a dozen Harleys. The bakery is my sanctuary. You know that smell? The one that hits you like a warm hug the moment you walk into a real bakery. The scent of yeast and sugar, of melting butter and toasted flour. That's the smell of my life's work. I'm not some big chain. It's just me, a couple of part-time helpers, and a whole lot of early mornings. I know my regulars by name, I know whose kid just lost a tooth, and I know Mrs. Gable always wants the end piece of the multigrain. It's a small, quiet life, and I love it. But a few weeks ago, the quiet was shattered in a way I never could have predicted. It was a Tuesday, usually a slow day. The morning rush had died down, and a gentle calm had settled over the shop. That's when she came in. A young woman, probably in her late 20s, with eyes that looked like they hadn't slept in a week. Holding her hand was a little boy, a spark of life with big, curious eyes, maybe 6 or 7 years old. He was buzzing with the energy only a child can have, while his mother seemed to be moving through molasses, weighed down by something I couldn't see. She moved slowly along the display case, her gaze lingering on the pastries but never quite settling. The little boy, however, had his eyes locked on one thing, the big, round loaves of sourdough bread I had just pulled from the oven, still cooling on the rack. Their golden brown crust was cracked just so, and the smell was intoxicating. "Mommy, can we get that one?" he whispered, his voice full of hope. "The big one. You promised we could have real bread for sandwiches." The mother gave him a weak, tired smile. "Let's see, sweetie." She picked up one of the loaves, feeling its weight in her hands. I saw her glance at the price tag. $8. To some, it's nothing. A cup of fancy coffee. But I saw the flicker in her eyes, the subtle clenching of her jaw. It was a calculation, a silent battle being waged right there in the middle of my bakery. She held the bread for a long moment, her thumb stroking the crust as if to memorize the feel of it. Then, with a sigh so quiet I almost missed it, she placed the loaf back on the rack. "Not today, baby," she said softly, her voice barely audible. We'll just get the sliced kind from the corner store later. It's fine." She tried to steer him toward the door, but the little boy wasn't having it. His lower lip began to tremble. His perfect, hopeful morning was crumbling. He pulled his hand free and pointed back at the sourdough, his voice rising, small but piercing, cutting through the calm of the shop. "But you promised. Why not?" And then came the words that stopped my heart, that made every other customer in the store freeze. He wasn't trying to be dramatic. He was just a little boy speaking a devastating truth. He looked around at the strangers, his face crumpling, and cried out, "My mum can't afford bread." The silence was deafening. The happy chatter died instantly. A wave of shame so thick you could taste it washed over his mother's face. She turned a deep, painful red, grabbed his arm, and whispered, "Don't say that. Shh. Let's go." She practically dragged him out of the store, not making eye contact with anyone. The little brass bell on the door gave a cheerful, mocking jingle as it closed behind them. I just stood there, frozen behind the counter, my heart a lead weight in my chest. By the time my brain caught up, I grabbed the loaf of bread, ran to the door, and burst out onto the sidewalk. But they were gone, vanished into the city as if they were never there at all. The rest of the day was a blur. I couldn't shake the image of that little boy's face or the utter humiliation on his mother's. Every customer who bought a pastry, every person who casually dropped $10 on a cake, it all just twisted the knife. Hours passed. I cleaned the counters, swept the floor, and prepared the starters for the next day, all under a gray fog of guilt. As closing time approached, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty street. I was just about to flip the sign to closed when I heard it. A low, guttural rumble that grew steadily louder. It wasn't a car. It was the sound of thunder on a clear day. I looked out the window and my blood ran cold. Lined up in front of my little bakery, taking up every parking space, were at least a dozen massive motorcycles. Harleys. And getting off them were men who looked like they could chew through steel leather vests, tattoos, chains, the whole 9 yards. Emblazoned on their backs was the unmistakable logo of the Hells Angels. The bell on my door jingled, and the leader, a mountain of a man with a graying beard and a face like a roadmap of hard living, stepped inside. He blocked the light from the doorway, his shadow falling over me. He scanned the shop, his eyes passing over the cakes and cookies before they landed right on me. Then he looked over at the rack of sourdough, the very one the little boy had pointed to, and took a slow, deliberate step forward. My throat went dry. My hands, dusted with a fine layer of flour, felt clammy against the wooden counter. All the nightmare scenarios you read about as a small business owner flashed through my mind. A robbery? Vandalism? Some kind of protection racket? I gripped the edge of the counter, my knuckles turning white, and prepared for the worst. The big man took another step, the heavy thud of his boots echoing in the sudden quiet of my shop. The scent of old leather and road dust mingled with the sweet smell of my pastries, a bizarre and unsettling combination. He finally stopped, standing right in front of the cooling rack. He didn't look at me, but at the sourdough loaves. He reached out a hand thick with calluses and decorated with a skull ring, and gently, almost reverently, touched the crust of one of the loaves, the same one the woman had held. "Is this the bread?" he asked. His voice was a low rumble, like gravel being poured onto concrete. It wasn't aggressive, just deep, and heavy with an authority that demanded an answer. I could only manage a nod, my voice having completely abandoned me. He grunted, a sound of confirmation. Then he turned his head slowly, and his dark, intense eyes finally met mine. They weren't cruel, as I had expected. They were sharp, intelligent, and tired, like he'd seen far too much of the world. "Heard you had a little boy in here earlier," he said. It wasn't a question. Crying 'cause his mama couldn't afford a loaf of bread. My jaw must have dropped. How could he possibly know that? The store had been nearly empty. The few other customers had scurried out shortly after the woman and her son had left, embarrassed to be witnesses. As if reading my mind, another man stepped forward from the group. He was older, with a long gray ponytail, and to my utter shock, I recognized him. It was Mr. Hemlock. He came in every Thursday for a Danish and a black coffee. A quiet, unassuming man who read the paper at a corner table for an hour. I'd never seen him in anything but a flannel shirt and jeans. Now he was wearing a leather vest with the same terrifying logo as the others. He gave me a sheepish look. "Sorry, Sarah," he said, using my name for the first time ever. "I was in the corner. I saw the whole thing. I made a call." The leader, the mountain of a man, turned his attention back to me. "We don't stand for that," he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "Not in our town. No kid goes hungry. Not on our watch." He gestured around the shop with a sweep of his massive arm. "So here's what's going to happen. We're buying your bread." I blinked, confused. The sourdough?" He gave a short, sharp laugh that didn't have much humor in it. "All of it," he declared. "Every loaf. The sourdough, the rye, the baguettes, all of it. Bag it up." His men started moving, their presence filling every inch of my small shop. They were surprisingly organized, pointing at what they wanted, forming a line. I was so stunned I could barely move. This had to be a dream. "But that's hundreds of dollars worth of bread," I stammered. The leader just reached into his vest and pulled out a roll of cash so thick it couldn't have been wrapped by a bank. He peeled off several $100 bills and slapped them down on the counter. "This cover it." "Good. Now, we got one more problem." I looked at the pile of money, then back at his face, my mind reeling. "What's that?" "We don't know who they are," he said, his voice dropping again. "The mother and her boy. Don't know where to find them. This whole damn pile of bread isn't worth a thing if we can't get it to them." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze locking onto mine. "You know them? They regulars?" My heart sank. That was the problem. I had never seen them before in my life. "No," I said, the word catching in my throat. "No, I've never seen them before today." A collective sigh of frustration seemed to move through the group of bikers. Their grand gesture was falling apart. The leader stood there staring at the bread, a muscle working in his jaw. For a moment it seemed like that was it. The trail was cold. Then my eyes flickered up to the small black dome in the corner of the ceiling, the security camera. "Wait," I said, my voice suddenly clear and strong. "Wait, I might have something." I rushed to the small monitor I kept under the counter. With shaking fingers I rewound the footage from earlier that day. And there they were, the young mother, her face etched with worry. The little boy, his eyes full of hope, pointing at the bread. The image was perfectly clear. "I have them," I said, turning the monitor around. "Right here." The leader and Mr. Hemlock crowded around the small screen. The big man stared intently at the woman's face on the monitor, his expression unreadable. He watched the whole heartbreaking scene play out again in grainy black and white. When it was over, he stood up straight and looked at me, a new, cold fire in his eyes. He pointed a thick finger at the screen. "That boy," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "He's wearing a T-shirt for the Northwood Elementary Dragons." He turned to his men, his voice now a booming command that filled the entire bakery. "That's 3 blocks from here. We're gonna find them. Hemlock, you start calling. The rest of you, with me. We're not going home until that kid is eating a sandwich on the best damn bread in this city." The bakery transformed into an unlikely command center. The thunder of their motorcycles was replaced by the low murmur of determined men making calls. Mr. Hemlock, who I now knew as Hemlock, was on his phone, calling contacts I couldn't begin to imagine, his voice calm and methodical. The leader, who the others called Prez, coordinated the effort with the focus of a battlefield general. Meanwhile, I bagged up every single loaf of bread in the shop, my hands moving on autopilot, while my mind tried to process the surreal scene unfolding around me. These men, who looked like the villains from a movie, were on a mission of pure, unadulterated kindness. An hour blurred into 2. A few of the bikers had roared off into the twilight, dispatched to scout the streets around Northwood Elementary. The rest waited, the tension in the small shop palpable. Then Hemlock hung up his phone, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Got 'em," he said, and the entire room seemed to exhale at once. "Single mom. Name's Maria. Her son is named Leo. Lost her job as a waitress 2 weeks ago. Landlord's giving her grief. They live in the Oak Street Apartments, number 2B, just 2 blocks past the school." Prez nodded once, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "All right, load it up." His men began grabbing the bags of bread, their arms overflowing. "Sarah," Prez said, turning to me, "you're coming with us." It wasn't a request. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my keys, flipped the sign to closed, and locked the door to my empty bakery, its shelves completely bare for the first time since I opened. I felt like I was being swept up in a force of nature. The ride to the Oak Street Apartments was short but unforgettable. I was in the back of a beat-up pickup truck that followed the procession of bikes, a veritable parade of chrome and leather carrying a cargo of carbs. We pulled up to a tired-looking brick building, and the bikers cut their engines, plunging the street into an eerie silence. They moved with quiet efficiency, grabbing the bags of bread and a few other grocery bags I hadn't even noticed them loading. Milk, eggs, cheese, lunch meat. They had thought of everything. We climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, the worn carpet muffling the sound of our footsteps. Prez stood in front of apartment 2B and knocked. It wasn't a loud, intimidating knock, but a firm, respectful one. After a moment, the door cracked open and Maria's face appeared in the gap, looking even more worn out than she had that afternoon. Her eyes widened in fear when she saw the crowd of large, leather-clad men standing in her hallway. Can I help you?" she stammered, her hand instinctively moving to block the door. Prez took a step back, holding up his empty hands in a gesture of peace. "Ma'am," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "my name is John. We're not here to cause any trouble." He gestured behind him. "We heard your son was looking for some good bread today." At that moment, little Leo squeezed past his mom, his eyes huge as he took in the mountain of a man and the crew behind him. His gaze fell on the bags in their hands, the familiar shape of the round sourdough loaves clearly visible. A tiny gasp escaped his lips. Maria looked utterly bewildered, her eyes darting from Prez to me, standing nervously in the back. Recognition dawned on her face, followed by a fresh wave of shame. I'm so sorry about earlier, she whispered. He didn't mean anything by it. He didn't do anything wrong, Prez said firmly. A kid ought to be able to have good bread. He nodded to his men, and one by one they stepped forward and placed the bags of bread and groceries gently on the floor in front of her door. It was a mountain of food. Enough for weeks. Maria stared at it, her jaw slack, tears welling up in her eyes. She put a hand to her mouth, a choked sob escaping. I can't pay for this, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. It's already paid for, Prez said. No kid in our town goes hungry. You remember that. He then knelt down, bringing his massive frame to eye level with Leo. He reached into his vest and pulled out something small. It was a little pin, a tiny silver motorcycle. He pressed it into Leo's small hand. You're a good boy looking out for your mom, he said gruffly. You be strong for her, you hear? Leo nodded, speechless, clutching the pin like it was the greatest treasure in the world. Maria was openly crying now, tears of disbelief and gratitude streaming down her face. Thank you, she sobbed. I don't know what to say. Thank you. Prez just gave a slight nod, then stood up. Let's go, boys, he said to his crew. And just like that, they turned and filed silently down the stairs. I gave Maria a small watery smile, and she mouthed, "Thank you," to me again before closing her door. I followed the bikers back out into the cool night air. The street was quiet. The only sound, the distant city hum. They mounted their bikes, and with a simultaneous roar that shook the very ground, they came to life. Prez looked over at me one last time. He didn't smile, but he gave me a nod of respect. And then they were gone, a rumble of thunder fading into the darkness, leaving behind only the smell of exhaust and an act of profound kindness that I knew I would never, ever forget.